Hello and welcome to this Gluware highlight video to introduce some of the new features in the Gluware 5.3 release for the Network RPA application. Network RPA is our no-code drag and drop process automation builder. And for a full overview of the 5.3 release, check out the webinar available on gluware.com and also linked in this video notes. So let's jump into the content and get signed into Gluware. So let's navigate into the Device Manager app first. One of the things that we're going to jump into with Network RPA is a new task called backup or run the config backup. So backup and restore is a new capability introduced in 5.3. We have a full tutorial on that feature set, so I encourage you to watch that video as well. But just from a quick highlight standpoint, you can select devices in your Device Explorer and you can execute a backup. Then via the double clicking on any device and going into the detailed view, there is now a view called backups. You see all the backups that have been taken, and you can restore a backup config onto a device. So this is a new operation in Gluware. Previously or currently, we have the ability to discover a device. And generally with discovery, we run what we call a snapshot. Discovery is essentially querying the device to interrogate it, to pull it into Gluware. A snapshot historically is capturing the running configuration, but now in 5.2 we introduced custom capture commands, so we can really capture anything about that device you would like. But backup is a new operation that actually transfers the running configuration into Gluware, stores it, and then using the vendor mechanism has the ability to restore it. So a backup is a new operation that is very specifically designed so that it can be restored onto the device from a config restoration standpoint. So with that quick explanation, let's navigate into Network RPA, into our workflow library. So here in my workflow library, to speed up the pace of this particular session, we're going to use all pre-built workflows or workflows that are already built. So I'm going to search for backup. I have my backup demo here, and we're going to go ahead and edit this workflow to walk you through it. So very quickly, once again, Network RPA is our drag and drop process building application that is essentially made up of tasks that complete the end-to-end workflow or the orchestrated, end-to-end sequence of things that are going to take place in this workflow. All you have to do is, like this new task we're going to be showcasing is the backup. If I wanted to insert that, I could browse all my tasks and view by category. I can also search. So if I search for backup, I see this task here. And if I wanted to add this in, I can just drag and drop it into the timeline. And that's how I add a task. This one would be redundant, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it out. So let's just walk through what's in this particular demo, because we're going to be highlighting this new task, which is backup device. So when you run a workflow, Gluware is going to pass all of the devices in your inventory into the tasks. So you have various options on how to then select those devices. You can pass them all, you can pre-filter, or you can just institute an initial task that is a filter task. So in this case, I'm going to be filtering for my devices that contain, the name contains CSR. So I'm going to just be executing a backup on my Cisco CSR 1000V devices. So that's my filter. So those devices are passed down to the next task as an input parameter. And then I'm just simply executing a backup. One of the other features we're going to get into is new templating support, but this feature does leverage a templating capability here, in that we're inserting a date timestamp as the name of the backup. We're calling it a backup with the timestamp of when this occurred. And you optionally can capture a new snapshot. As I dive into it in pretty extensive depth in the backup and restore tutorial, we do suggest capturing a snapshot when you execute a backup. In this demo, just to save time and for simplicity, I'm not going to do that activity. And then in this particular example, I have a send email where I'm going to notify the user or the runner of this workflow that these devices were backed up. So I'm going to have a per target output. So it's going to loop through the targets and going to give me my device name. Okay, so with that, what I wanted to show you is, once this workflow is built, the process is to save your workflow. You validate the workflow to ensure all required parameters and variables and things like that, if that applies, are there. Validates input parameters, licensing, all of those checks are done. So now we can run the test and execute. And we'll go to activity. And we'll see this task running, this workflow running. We can see the workflow running, and in the view on the side here, we can navigate between info, target, and tasks. I like the task view because you can see it stepping through the various activities. So first we filtered the incoming targets, which are all our devices. In my org, I have 21 devices. I'm filtering for CSR. So that was filtered down to 5 devices in my inventory. The backup is now complete. The email is now complete. This workflow is now complete. So just for sake of like closing the loop on this, if I navigate to back to my device manager. Okay, so here's my backup by, backup on. And if I just browse down in the column here, I can see these CSRs that met my condition. Today's the 27th. And again, I have a timestamp here, 12:59 p.m. This was just about 2 minutes ago. Did complete. So I have that record here in my grid. If I double click on any one of these, like this particular router, and navigate into the backup and restore view, I also have the historical backups here. I can see that this name was fed in by that Network RPA task. And let's just say that I was conducting this backup prior to a change, and now I want to back out of that change. I could restore the configuration with this operation here. Again, that's just a quick demonstration and highlight of the new backup task that is available in Network RPA. The next task I want to highlight for you that's new in Gluware 5.3 and Network RPA is our ability to sync with ServiceNow's CMDB. So for that, I'm going to switch orgs here and go over to an organization that is configured to have connectivity. So one of the prerequisites for a CMDB sync is in my settings and org. In my CMDB integrations, I have to make sure that this is turned on. I have the URL configured. In this case, the ServiceNow is the CMDB, and I have the authentication method and the credentials that I'm passing in. This is pulled from our vault. So I have to have that piece enabled first. Also, back to Device Manager. If I select my devices here, one of the new operations you're going to see here is the ability to trigger the sync devices. So again, just a quick recap of this feature. You're going to determine for various fields of your inventory where Gluware is a source of truth or where your inventory is a source of truth. For example, in ServiceNow, if the device name comes from ServiceNow, if it's updated in ServiceNow, when we sync, this field will be updated. Since Gluware is talking to this inventory live and pulling things like the OS version, if the OS version source of truth is Gluware, when the sync operation occurs, Gluware will push those fields, the OS version, up into the ServiceNow CMDB. So that's just a very quick introduction as to how this occurs. If we jump into Network RPA and go into the workflow library, this particular workflow library just has this one workflow, which is a demo of the ServiceNow CMDB Sync. So let's go ahead and edit this workflow. And it's, again, a very simple operation. You just drag and drop ServiceNow CMDB Sync. There is no configuration of this task, so it is configured by default once you drag and drop it in. The reason you would want this potentially in a workflow are a couple of reasons. One would be that you are using a Gluware workflow to update device parameters. So this could happen in a number of ways. You could update things like the site, that's an administrative setting that's allocated with the device. You could be executing an OS upgrade, therefore changing an OS version. Then you may do a new snapshot or discovery that captures that version in the Gluware database. So anytime you're changing the Gluware device information, you may want to push a CMDB sync to make sure that data is current. Another option would be in ServiceNow, you're making a change and you can make an API call to run a workflow like this one, which triggers the sync on the Gluware side. So again, numerous reasons why, but pretty simple. Drag and drop this in, apply it, run it, and this triggers the CMDB sync. Next, we're going to navigate back into the org I was initially in here, and we're going to introduce a capability to run a generic API call. For this one, let's go ahead and navigate into an example workflow here. So for this workflow, I'm going to type API, and we're going to look at this particular workflow here, which is running an external API call to a particular external website. So let's go ahead and edit this workflow. So again, a very simple workflow, one operation. There's, again, numerous reasons why you would want to make a third-party API call. And I'm going to click on this particular task so you see the operations. But basically, you drag and drop this in, and then you can integrate any API call. So what that gives you is the ability to, without really any coding, you can make a GET or a POST or a PUT and interact with a third-party system. This is powerful because prior to this particular task being supported, this was previously supported by going into Gluware's IDE, we call Gluware Lab. You would build your API call, you would publish it as a package into your org, and then you would have your API call. So there was a building phase, a publishing phase, and then a consumption phase. Feedback from customers and partners and others is they wanted more of a quick and easy way to integrate an API call without using Gluware Lab. So that's why we've introduced the external API call. Another quick bit of information is if you've ever worked with an API tool like Postman, Postman has repositories of example API calls, and with Postman, you can do API operations. This is essentially the same thing. So you have the ability to build out your operations. When you make an API call, you have to have API connection authentication or connection information. So that's the first field here. And we've selected this request API service provider. So what I do want to quickly cover is where do these service providers come from? So a service provider today is defined in our model editor. If I navigate into globals, and if I navigate into API service providers, I can see here that in this instance of Gluware, I have 3 API service providers provided here. This first one I'm going to highlight is a website called request.in. So I just want to show you very quickly that this is a third-party website that was kind of just used for testing and development. So this is kind of interesting. This website is just an API endpoint that allows you to test your API call. So for demonstration and test purposes, this is really good. These are all the gets you can do. And if you click on each one of these, it's get single user, get a list of users. It shows you examples of executing a get and what the response is going to be. So this is purely for test and demonstration purposes, but I can see here that I can get users as an example. So this particular host, which again, this is the endpoint we're pointing at, the base URL path is /API. That comes directly from this, in that all of the base requests are /API, then /the path. And for this particular one, there's no security type. So there's no user password or authentication like basic or OAuth tied to this. So there's no authentication. So back to Network RPA and our workflow library. I'll search for those API workflows again. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one again. Let's edit. So now you have context when you are defining an API integration. You build the connection type in config modeling and just in terms of defining it. Then you have a drop down here to select that. So that's been done. So now I'm doing /users, and I am doing a get operation. So pretty simple in terms of this particular call. When you're doing a get, there's no body parameters. If I change this, and you will see other examples, or you can see that when I change to a put or a post, I'm going to have additional parameters that I would pass in with that operation. But one key thing here is that whenever you're doing an API call, if you want Gluware to store the data on return, so when we do a get and this particular API is going to we say get users, it's going to return this object to us in JSON. So to capture that object, you want to go into your variables and references, and you create a variable. In this case, it's called response get, and we're assigning it into this task response. So we're just creating a variable and sticking it in there, and then we can do things with that variable. In subsequent demos, you're going to see quite a few more examples where we're kind of manipulating data objects that are returned from tasks. But for this one, let's just keep it very simple. Once it's set here, you would save it and validate it. That has already been done. So let's just go ahead and execute this workflow and say execute. Go to activity. And we're going to open the log up. I'm going to highlight the log. I'm going to expand the log there. And what you're going to see in the log is Gluware is running this task. We're doing an API call get of this path /API/users. And this is the response object that we were returned. And this has been stored as a variable in the Gluware system. So now we can do something with that. So from a basic, let's say, hello world or test and verification, we've looked at our API endpoint. We know what we're going to get from a response. From Gluware, we've made that API call, and we got the response as expected. So this one is like just a really basic of how to build an API call, how to issue that call, and how to look at the response in a log. So now we're going to look at one other example here that we already have defined in our system. So we're going to go back to the workflow library, type API, again, searching through our workflows. Now we're going to hit a system that's actually running a Gluware instance. So what I just want to highlight is whenever you're testing or working with an API endpoint, you want to understand the API endpoint documentation. So in the case of Gluware, you can enter in your Gluware instance /API-docs docs. This is a documentation endpoint, and I can see the API calls available here. So anytime you're, again, looking at interworking with making API calls, you want to understand the documentation. So how do I connect to that endpoint? What is authentication? After you understand how to connect, you want to understand the calls you can make and what data sets you can get back. So with Gluware, I can get my devices, I can get my orgs, I can get /devices, so on and so forth. So you want to look through and understand very clearly your documentation on the API endpoint and how you're going to use it. So with that quick introduction, let's go back into Gluware here, and I have an example running against a Gluware endpoint. So let's edit this workflow. Again, very simple. I'm doing a connection to this particular API endpoint, which is my Gluware instance. I am doing the path is /organization, so I'm doing a get of /organizations. I don't have to change anything here, but you can see here just another example where I'm interfacing with an API endpoint and I'm getting data out of it. So let's go ahead and execute this. And again, I do have a variable tied to the output of that. Go to the activity. And I can go in my logs again. And again, I see here that I'm sending my API call, the Gluware endpoint /API/organizations, and here's the response. So again, another relatively quick and straightforward, or let's say basic demonstration of you define your API endpoint, you understand the call you want to make, you build that call, you tie a variable to it, and then you can execute that call. And now I can integrate this particular API call with an orchestrated action. So very useful when you want to do, let's say, tactical integrations with third-party systems that require an API call. So next, we're going to jump into a capability. It is a task that ties in very well to what I was just talking about. So let's go back to our workflow library. And this next new task is called Object Compare. So I'm going to search Object, and we're going to go into this basic workflow I've built called Object Compare Demo. And let's go ahead and edit this workflow. So the notion object is pretty familiar with folks in programming worlds, but usually an object is a data structure. And one of the common things that you need to do with data structures is just simply compare them and have an output or outcome to say, are they equal or not? And if they're not equal, what is the difference? And so this is a building block, but it is very useful, especially for things that are returning data sets. We just covered API examples where APIs are returning data sets. We have other examples we're going to run through coming up where we are interfacing with devices and pulling data off devices, like their software versions or an NTP state or a BGP state. When we're pulling that data out, there's numerous use cases where you're going to want to compare that data. And so that's what this new object compare task does. So just by looking at the configuration of it, all you're simply doing is saying, I want to compare, in this case, two objects, variable 1 and variable 2. And you're going to say, well, what are variable 1 and variable 2? So let's go into the Gluware variables. And for this demonstration, just to keep it simple and not introduce networking concepts, routers, switches, firewalls, all of those things, I have defined, and this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in terms of another feature we're going to talk about, which is a new template, a new variable type, and a new templating capability. But variable 1 is of type template, and I have a data set here. So this data set, again, is just for an example, but this data set has several objects 1, 2, and 3. So it's got city, postcode, country, so on and so forth. So I have a data type here. I have a data set here. And let's look at var2. So var2 also is a data set of several objects. But what I've done for demonstration purposes is made some edits to it. So instead of New York, I put New York with a little typo 1 there. What else is different here? I've added an additional object 4 and just put 1. So I know from a testing and validation standpoint, I know var1 and var2 are different, but now I'm going to go ahead and have Gluware compare them. So back to the object compare, this task is going to execute a comparison. And then if I look at my variables and references, it is creating a response called a compare response. And this compare response will be a JSON data structure that has the response, and from it, you can pull out things like the difference. So how do we examine those results or use them programmatically? Well, in this case, I just want to show you what's generated. So we're going to generate an email. And in that email, I'm going to say, this was var1, this was var2. Here's my compare response object. So here's the whole thing that task is generating. And then I'm going to actually pull out a specific piece of that response, which is compare response.diff. So there are pieces in that structure I can pull out by printing out just compare response.diff. This is like kind of key value pair. This is the key diff, and I'm going to print out the value when this email comes in. So let's go ahead and execute this task, and we'll take a look. So let's go to the activity. And again, whenever a workflow is running, you have the ability to look at the info level, target level, task level. I can see that, again, this ran very quickly. There's not a lot of there's no interactions with devices, so it runs very quickly. I can navigate into my log, expand the log, and look at the whole interaction here. The logging is quite comprehensive in that it is giving you all the data structures here, so you can look at that in the log and, of course, download the log. But just because as an operator, you may be running these workflows scheduled or triggered, you're not always sitting here looking at the Gluware UI and looking at the log. You may want this information sent to you. So let's take a look at the results. So here's the email that came in. I just want to show you again, just for understanding what has happened here, is in my email, I printed out the various variables. So variable 1, variable 2, I showed you what those structured looked like. Here's the comparison object. So I can see there's, and from a key value standpoint, equal is false, and diff shows me the difference. So the difference is object 1 is different, and object 4, meaning I only have 1 and I didn't have an object 4. So if I want to highlight, I could pull out the equal or the diff. In this case, I just pulled out the diff and I said the difference is, and just highlighted that. So again, this is an example that's just using abstract data here, just data that is used for examples, but we'll move on and show more examples that are leveraging use cases with network parameters. So let's jump back into our workflow library, and I'm going to search for object again, and we're going to take a look at the workflow that's object compare ad hoc query demo. So let's go ahead and edit this workflow. So from a workflow standpoint, I'm going to filter my targets, the devices in my inventory, picking on those CSRs, again, in this example. Then I'm going to pass those CSRs into a task that is an ad hoc query task. So this ad hoc query on each device is going to execute a show version and is querying for the string iOS XE software version 16.12.01a. So it's querying that output. So this is more of a practical use case where I want to run an operation that's capturing data from my devices. And in the variable selection, I'm calling that return data ad hoc 1. And then I run the same command again. In this case, I'm running a show command again. Again, go back to my task configuration, show version. Now, why would I want to do this? Well, why I may want to do this is I may be checking my inventory for the running versions, or if I had a step in the middle that was changing the operating system, I would want to validate that it did change. So again, this is just an example for demonstration purposes, but now I want to compare those. So this particular query is generating ad hoc 1, this one's generating ad hoc 2. I'm going to compare them and email the results. And again, on my object compare, I am creating a compare response. But now this time, I do want to point out this is a target variable type. You actually, when you're working with targets like, in this case, CSR 1000Vs, we're going to have an object per target. So we're going to have a compare response per target. And then in my email, I'm going to walk through that and say, for the devices, for each device, what is the compare response? What is the final value? Remember, I had .equal and I had .diff. So I just want to see the compare response for each device. So I do have, again, tying in some of the templating that we'll go into, but I am doing a for loop to loop through the devices and then print that out in the email. So let's go ahead and execute this one. Go to my activity. While it's running, I can look at my logging. I can see it running through here. I'm going to get ready to look at the results via email as well here. Okay, so the workflow completed here in 24 seconds. Again, you have the ability to look at your log and see exactly what happened. I'm going to pull in the email again. So in this case, if I look at the email, again, I generated a line here that says 4 devices queried to the show version different to the 16.12.01a, and it ran through my devices and I got the output being false. So in this case, I knew they weren't going to be false. I was running I was running that comparison and running that capture one after the other. And so I knew that the OS version was not changing, but this is just an example to articulate. You can kind of customize the way you want the output to look. And I can use HTML tagging and make this look a whole lot prettier. But this is just a basic example of how comparison, an object compare, is a very useful function in Gluware. In the last section of this highlight demo, we're going to jump a little bit deeper into the new templating capability and support. So just from a quick background standpoint, I'm going to open up this web page called LiquidJS, because what Gluware has incorporated is the support for the templating language called LiquidJS. And so this is a powerful templating language that you can learn about here. And with the playground here, you can test using this language in terms of looping and passing variables and all kinds of other powerful operations. So we're not going to go to the details of that here, but just to note that now we support the LiquidJS templating language, and we're going to look at two quick examples of how that can be used. So let's search template, and we're going to look at the templating variable using, again, an ad hoc query. So let's go ahead and edit this workflow. So very similar to before, we're going to filter our targets, highlighting those CSR routers. There's 5 CSRs in my environment. On those devices, I'm going to be executing a query. This is the same one I just showed. So we're going to be executing a show version, looking for a specific OS version that is going to be saved as ad hoc 1. We are then going to send an email. So in the first part of the introduction of templating, what I want to highlight here is in pretty much any text field in the Gluware task configuration, you can insert a template that will then get rendered at runtime. This one's pretty powerful because this is the send email, and this could be, posting in Slack or updating ServiceNow. This is going to execute, if you look at this kind of simple template, for each device, we are going to print out the ad hoc query result for the device and use the variable device.name. And we're going to have a couple breaks, and then we're going to be show version match. And then we're going to be looking at the string of that ad hoc response and then the match count. So one of the things that ad hoc query returns is a match count when you're looking at that comparison. So again, this particular demo is just highlighting that we're able to put a templating language directly into the body of an email message. So let's go ahead and execute this example. Go to activity. It's going to run pretty quickly here in that we're just running a quick show version on 5 devices. Okay, 11 seconds. The workflow has completed. Let me pull in that email. So here we see the email generated. So again, highlighting that the templating language enabled us to loop through the devices, here each of the device names, and the show version match count. So I know I have a match for each one of those when comparing to that particular OS version that I was looking for. So that is, again, fairly quick demonstration of using the templating language in a text field, in that case, the email body message. This last demo, we're going to look at a little bit more sophisticated example where we're going to be using a template variable. So let's, again, go to Workflow Library. We'll search template. And this particular workflow I want to show you is called template var NSA demo. So let's go ahead and edit that. So node state assessment is another form of querying a device state. Again, not going to go deeply into the different forms of state validation we have. Ad hoc query is one. Query is running a show command and then kind of looking for a specific response. So you're looking for something and you're saying, does it match or not? When we assess node state, we're pulling in the output of that, and then you can have a query looking for really anything based on that. So in this example, in config modeling, we have a state looking at the NTP state. So that we're not going to go into exactly what that's doing, but looking at like a show NTP status and then capturing that. And then we're going to be sending an email. So I want to quickly click on the send email task here. And what you're going to see here is in the results, we're just putting a variable here. So whatever that variable gets resolved to will get printed out in the email. So what is in this variable called NSA results email? Well, now in your variable, when you build variables in Gluware, one is assess node state is doing a per target variable for each one of those devices to capture a model with the NTP status. Now we have another variable defined in the system. Now we support variable type template. So you have all these different types. You can say the variable is of a type template, and then you can put the template into here, and then that will resolve anywhere you reference this variable. So again, instead of having to kind of put it in the email as text, now you put it here. One difference you're going to notice is when you're working with a variable type template, it will highlight the syntax that you see here. So you have like the recognition of the LiquidJS templating. So in this particular case, we're going to be looping through the devices, print out the device name, and then we are printing out from that NSA NTP object. We're going to be walking it for each device ID. We're going to print the assessed node state. We're going to be printing that out. So this is just another variation of the example. With the introduction of templating, we have template variable types, and we have native templating, or the LiquidJS templating you could put directly into text fields. So this particular NSA node state assessment result email, I am referencing it here in an email. And again, I could put it in a Slack, I could put it in an update in ServiceNow and other things as well. So let's go ahead and execute this workflow. This one will take a little longer to run to execute the state assessment on each device. Okay, so the workflow has completed here in 25 seconds. Let's take a look at that email result. Okay, so here we have the email result, and this is looking at each device. In this case, I have kind of a full mesh where each of these are supposed to be paired with each other. And I can say that I can see here my NTP is not in a good state. So I can see my NTP state is unsynchronized. So if I look at it from the CSR 152 perspective, I'm unsynchronized, CSR1 unsynchronized. So if I was troubleshooting something and expected NTP to be synchronized, I would see here that I have an issue. So that concludes this brief run through or highlights the numerous capabilities that we've looked at in this video, which include the new backup task, the new CMDB Sync task, the new generic API call task, the object compare task, and the introduction of the LiquidJS templating. Thanks for your time today and interest in Gluware.